today about some work that I've done in food web evolution together with colleagues. Nicolas Leu from Paris, Michel Leroux from Montreal, Axel Rosberg from Belfast, Linus Karlsson from Umeå, and Ulf Diekman here at EASA. The talk is titled Emergence and Maintenance of Biodiversity Through Predation and Interference Competition. And when I think of biodiversity, I tend to think of something like this, a very nice coral reef with beautifully colored fish swimming around and so on. Basically a large ecosystem. But an ecosystem is very complex. There are many factors here, both biotic factors, abiotic factors, many types of interactions going on, and so forth. So to capture all of this from a theoretical perspective is very hard. So what one could do instead is to focus on a part of the ecosystem which we believe could be important for the dynamics. But even then, there are many interactions we could consider, predation, parasitism, etc. So we have to make a selection here. And one possible choice is to focus primarily on predation, the trophic interactions, because this represents the energy flow within the community. If we do this, we get food webs. And what are food webs? Well, typically they are networks or directed graphs which link two species if one of the species gets energy from the other. So in this case, you see the eagle is linked here to the fish because the eagle consumes the fish. These kind of food webs have been around for quite a while, and typically they are documented in this form. Either there is a link or there is no link, so it's a 1 or a 0. But of course, if one can, it's nice to include information about the energy flow as well. You see the eagle here consumes both the fish and the duck, and we have no way of saying how important the duck is in the diet relative to the fish. Of course, if we can, it's also nice to include other interactions, and in this talk I will include interference competition as well. So I will focus on 3 main questions. The first question is, how do predation and interference competition affect the emergence and maintenance of food webs? I will then ask whether conditions for initial diversification, when one of the morphs become 2, are somehow related to the final eventual diversity that evolves in this community. So if the initial diversification process is very rapid, does this indicate that we will end up with a very species-rich community or not? Finally, I will talk about related work, which is about the speciation process itself. Food webs most likely emerge through speciation over time, and thus this speciation process leaves some kind of signature in the food web structure. So can we find something in the food web structure which actually reflects the speciation process from which it has emerged? But I will start with the first question. And to address this, we will use a model of food web evolution. This model is based on the evolution of body size. So it's not a size-structured model as such, because individuals within a morph for a species are assumed to have a fixed body size from birth. But the body size is rather taken as the trait of this morph, and is allowed to evolve through small mutations over time. In this model, the rate at which one species predates on another depends on the relative difference in body size. So typically, or always actually for the parameters we consider, a larger individual will be more able to consume a smaller individual than vice versa. We also include interference competition, and this is actually very different because it's not asymmetric, it's symmetric. So interference competition is most intense with individuals of the same size. Whereas then predation is most intense when there is actually a difference between the body sizes. To give some advantage to larger individuals and to also reflect what actually goes on in nature, we include metabolic scaling. So the energy requirements to maintain a certain unit of body mass scales with the body size raised to the power of 3/4. And this is, I think, a well-established relationship in ecology that holds for a range of species and even taxa. Okay, so this figure then illustrates how interaction strengths are determined. So on this axis, we have relative difference in body size. And this is on a logarithmic scale, so we take the quotient of the body sizes and then the logarithm of that. This line indicates that the two species have the same body size. And for that, you see that the blue curve, the interference competition, is at its peak when they are the same body size. If you go to the left, we have individuals which are smaller. So if a species predates on smaller individuals, it's most efficient at some point here. Now we don't have any numbers here, but could be a factor of 100, for example, difference in body size, and then you have most intense predation taking place. These functions are normal Gaussian functions, and the parameters of interest is primarily the magnitude here and intensity of interference competition, the width here, and then the optimal difference here, the difference in body size, where predation is most efficient. Okay, so this is the only equation I will show during this talk, so bear with me. The underlying population dynamics or demographic dynamics is based on the well-known Lotka-Volterra equations. So there is nothing strange with this. We say that the per capita growth rate or the exponential growth rate of a morph equals a loss from mortality that is dependent on the body size of the species to include this metabolic scaling, a gain from predation on other individuals, a loss from predation, and a loss from interference competition. And if you write this out then mathematically, it is simply the equation down here. So xi is the density of the species, and ri is the trait value, which is the logarithm of its body size. And this long term here is just, intensity of predation here, and then this is transformed into new individuals directly of the species I. So this is the conversion efficiency, and these exponentials, which look a bit strange here, is just to reflect the fact that it's better to eat one big individual than maybe one small individual. You gain more biomass from eating one big individual. Alternatively, we could express these equations in biomass, and then this would actually disappear. In addition to this, we have one autotroph, which is simply a resource. Maybe think of it as a plant or something like this that can regrow by itself. So all other species in this model are required to consume others. But we have one single species which does not evolve and is actually capable of reproducing. And this is the basic resource which supplies energy to the model. The evolutionary dynamics then occurs through small mutations in this body size. And we can take this model, and from it we can calculate the invasion fitness, which is the initial growth rate that the rare mutant would have. And if this is positive, it means that the mutant can invade. And we do not use the canonical equation, which you often see in these equations, but rather we have a stochastic model where we randomly draw the next successfully invading mutant. I will not go into this scheme, so I'm happy to talk about it with you if you're interested, but otherwise just think of this as fitter individuals being able to invade. So the invasion fitness then gives us a function of the trait value. So if this is the resident population, then we can actually draw this function that come out of the model. And your growth rate here of a rare mutant on this axis, and you have the trait value of the body size on this axis. So you see that now mutants in this range can invade because the the initial growth rate will be positive. And also here there is some scope for invasion, provided that the mutation distance is sufficiently large. So let's say then that the mutant invades, then it initially has a positive growth rate, and it starts to grow in numbers. This means that it depresses the resident population. So once the mutant starts to grow, it becomes large, it affects the resident population, which gets a negative growth rate. And eventually, this poor resident will go extinct, and we're left with the mutant invader being the next resident in the system. And through this process, we can then build up a community. So here you see we ended in an evolutionarily stable strategy, but this does not always have to be so. We can also have something like this, a sequence of invasions. Now you see mutants here can invade because they have positive invasion fitness. But because of frequency dependence, this invasion fitness landscape change, and we end up with disruptive selection and the emergence of two coexisting morphs. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the model. So here you have the size on this axis, and this is simply time on a logarithmic scale. And what you see then is one initial ancestor branching out into two, which branch out into four. Here you see even one branch going extinct. So this and this branch compete for the same part of the niche space, but one sort of loses out in this race and goes extinct. And eventually we're left with a community here of coexisting individuals. So you may be interested in seeing what this invasion fitness landscape looks like, and I made a video of that as well. So you can see one morph becoming two morphs becoming four actually, and it goes on. You can note here also that while selection pressures are rather intense early on, they become moderate or very weak later on in this evolutionary process. So we actually end up with a really flat fitness landscape. It is only here in the beginning, here, that you see it's very, very bad to be. Then you cannot consume the basic resource, but you're consumed by others, and that's not good at all. But for the others, it's pretty much flat. Of course, if you zoom into this, we see these undulations of the fitness landscape, but at least on this scale, it looks rather flat. So one could ask if this means that evolution is completely neutral and you can have these morphs anywhere. And I don't think this is the case, because it becomes flat only since we have our morphs at these specific locations. If the morphs were at other randomly drawn locations, they would affect the fitness landscape and it would not look this flat. So it is flat now, but only because they have the position they have. Here you can see then the representation of another outcome with a bit lower mutational rate. But still it's the case that selection is much more intense early on. And you see the time is on a logarithmic scale here. So the early diversifications happen quickly, and then it takes a long time for the rest of the community to build up. But eventually it does build up, and we're left with a food web, which you see here. So in drawing this, we had to make some decision about when to cut off the links, and I think we selected 5 or possibly 10% to leave this. So if more than 5% of the diet comes from an individual, then we included a link, and then we're left with this figure. So can we then use this model to say something about the first question? How does predation and interference competition affect the emergence and maintenance of food webs? Well, to do that, we made figures where we basically ran the simulation for various parameter combinations and recorded the number of morphs, the final diversity, and we also recorded the maximum trophic level in this food web. We were left with the figures you see here. on this axis, you have the width of the predation kernel. So how wide it becomes. Wide means it can consume many species of different body size. Narrow means it has to specialize on maybe one morph than in the model. On the other, we had the optimal difference in trait value on the logarithmic scale. And as you can see, the outcome is very much dependent on the combination of the width and the optimal distance. And there is no single simple relationship that describes this. But you can see that if you go up diagonally like this, the number of morphs increases. But the trophic level actually goes down. And this is somewhat because, I do not fully understand this mechanism, but it's because they can are quite efficient at consuming each other, and then you end up with many individuals which are not so much spaced apart in trait space, so they do not differ so much in the trait values. You see also that here there is a rather sharp ridge where you go from having only one morph in this area up to 2 or more morphs. And this is actually because of the initial diversification. If you are in this corner, it's not possible to branch out initially, so you're left only with one species. With small mutational steps, a mutant morph cannot make the jump up to the second trophic level, where it could actually benefit from predating on its ancestor. You also see something interesting going on in the corner down here. Suddenly we have a very large increase in the number of morphs and a large increase in the trophic level. And this is the very interesting build-up of a food chain where actually smaller individuals predate on larger ones. So if you think about it, it's very bad to be big because to produce one more offspring you need to eat so much more. So it's better to be small if you can. And down in this corner, the width for this predation kernel is large, whereas the difference is not so large. You can basically consume individuals of the same size or larger sizes quite efficiently. And then it doesn't pay off to evolve higher and higher body sizes. Rather the opposite, it pays off to evolve smaller and smaller body sizes. And we see some kind of interactions like this, I think, in nature. But if you have ideas what this might represent, I would be very happy to talk with you. I think I will not say anything more with this, and let's go over to the interference competition. Interference competition has a very interesting effect on the model. If we have no interference competition at all, we get rather few morphs, but a high trophic level. We basically get the food chain where there's a large difference in body size between each step in the food chain, and there is nothing in between. But if you add on just a little bit of interference competition, then it suddenly pays off to colonize these areas of body size in between. So you no longer have a food chain, but you end up with more a food web. And this is always true. If you bring up the interference competition, you see you have an increase in the number of morphs. Quite slow increase, but still you have an increase. But you will see a relative decrease in the trophic level, simply because there will be less to eat, I think. They compete so much with each other, so they press down the population sizes. On this axis we have so this I should say is the magnitude then of the interference competition, and on this side we have the width of the interference competition. So if you are here, it means that species only compete, individuals only compete when they are very similar in body size. If you are over here, it means that they compete even if there's a large difference in body size. And having this small difference is very good to have a high diversity, because then it's really pays off to evolve a slightly different body size. You escape this interference competition, and you end up with a community where you have individual space at a distance corresponding roughly to the width of the interference competition. So you have evolutionary branching driven by the need to escape interference competition. So this is then much easier to interpret. Having a lower, more narrow interference competition leads to higher diversity, and having more intense interference competition leads to higher diversity. If you look at the maximum trophic level, then more intense interference competition reduces the trophic level, whereas a more narrow interference competition increases the trophic level. So this is much more easier to interpret. And this is finally also true for the energetic parameters. As you guess, if you bring in more energy into the system by having a smaller, this is the conversion efficiency. So if you go in this direction, you have a smaller loss, more energy transferred in each step. Then you bring up the diversity and you bring up the trophic level. And here we have the density dependence in the resource. So if you're down here, it means we have more of the resource, and that also brings up both the diversity in the number of morphs and the maximum trophic level. Okay, then I will move on to the second question. Are conditions for initial diversification and final diversity correlated? So to answer this, we need some measure. What do we mean by conditions for initial diversification? And we use the curvature at the first branching point. So we look at this invasion fitness landscape, and we simply check how much does it bend here at the first point where it branches out. So in this case, it would be an intense diversification, and here it would be a rather less intense diversification. So this is simply the measure we use. And for the final evolved diversity, we just take the number of morphs. And we can then do these plots where we run over combinations of parameters. So here we change over a range of values for the width of the feeding kernel and for optimal foraging distances. We just take a grid basically over all these parameter combinations, and we plot what we get. And we see that the strength of disruptive selection is actually very much correlated with the number of morphs. So it's a clear relationship. The more stronger the initial diversification, the more morphs you get. But if you hold one of them fixed and only vary the other, so this is the width, then the message is perhaps less clear. In particular here, where we hold the width fixed and we vary the optimal foraging distance, it's not so much variation at all in the initial diversification. But I think the message is still clear. Once we have the larger range, we get the correlation between the two. And we can do the same for interference competition. Still yields a somewhat positive relationship. And we can do the same for energetic parameters. And again, you see here it's not so clear. Actually, the number of morphs does not change. So I think the most interesting part is to look at the left figure where we varied over this range of parameters. Here, the conversion efficiency and the density dependence of the resource. Okay, that takes me to the third question. Does the speciation process affect food web structure? And we think the answer is yes. And we will look at one particular element of food web structure, which we think is affected. And that's food web intervality. So it has been recognized for quite a while, since the late 70s, that if you take a food web and you represent it in a matrix form, so you put your prey here, and you put your predators here, numbered 1 to 11, and as well here. And then you type in a 1 if the predator eats the prey, and a 0 if the predator doesn't eat the prey. Then there's usually some labeling of the species, which will give you the ones in consecutive blocks, like this. This is a consecutive block, this is a consecutive block, this is consecutive. This is not consecutive because we have one gap. but you see the overall picture is rather close to this consecutive blocks. And this is one statement of food web intervality, known as the consecutive runs property. And if you take empirical food web data, you can usually label the species somehow and get a matrix which has this structure. It's quite remarkable, I think, that this should be the case, because if you take any other network, you usually don't have this property. You can relabel as you want, but it's just a blur of ones and zeros. So one interpretation of this is that species can be ordered along a niche axis. Say that perhaps body size is the important thing for the predation, as it was in the model I just described. In that case, we could order the species along a niche axis, just place them perhaps randomly. These here then are the, in this case, body sizes of the species. And we then assume that a predator, like this species number 5 here, would consume all the species within a range, a size range then, or some other range in this niche space, centered around some foraging trait or point. So we can build up a food web like this, and this gives perfectly interval food webs. So one interpretation is that the niche space would somehow be one-dimensional. But we made another model where we did not necessarily have a one-dimensional niche space, but it could be any dimension, in this case 2 dimensions. And as before, we played species V1, V2, V3, and we draw these intervals which now became circles centered around some foraging trait. So pretty much the same. But what we did was we changed the way we draw this placement of the species. So instead of just taking them randomly, we had a process with speciation. So basically a random walk, but sometimes they speciate. And that was just a method we placed our species in this. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. So the important parameter are the speciation rate and the dimension of this niche space, which can be 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, and so forth. The rule then for the food web is just to connect 2 species if the vulnerability trait and the foraging trait are in the same disk. And this is the result. And here we have the dimension of the niche space, and here you see what happens when we increase the speciation rate. Down here means high intervality, and up here means low intervality. So as we increase the speciation rate, we go from low intervality up to high intervality in any niche space dimension. So it's a nice way of showing that speciation, actually, frequent speciation causes food web intervality. Also high niche space dimension eventually leads to food web intervality. And we did this first numerically, but later we proved mathematically that this holds for a range of models of this kind. I don't have so much time left, so I will just give you a glimpse of why this is so. Basically, we can order the species in the order they would appear in a phylogenetic tree. So we take the prey, order them as they would be in a phylogenetic tree, and by the way the model is designed, a predator will typically consume related prey, and that gives you these consecutive blocks. So there are some more predictions coming out of this, such as the optimal relabeling of the species should somehow correspond to a phylogenetic tree. I will end then by just summarizing the main points. The first is that evolution of body size can indeed lead to the emergence of food webs, but the outcome depends very much on how differences in body size affect predation or consumption ability. Interference competition facilitates diversification in these models, but it reduces the maximal trophic level. We found also that if you had intense initial diversification, you often but not always ended up with a species-rich community. And finally, we proposed then, though it's still, I guess, partly an open question, that food web intervality is not reflecting a one-dimensional niche space so that predators only target prey depending on their size or some other characteristic, but rather that this reflects the speciation process that underlies the formation of the food web. Thank you.
All right, time for some questions. Yeah, over there, again. Please wait for the microphone.
So, I'd like you to comment on how often in current food webs do we see a multi-trophic level community that's assembled via speciation of particular clades. So I can think of, say, the Cameroon Crater Lakes and classic adaptive radiation leading to a dozen or so species, all of which are at the same trophic level, to my knowledge. So, are you aware, do you have some feeling for how often you can generate communities across different levels that are really a single clade as opposed to basically insects and birds and frogs and fish and so on being
right. Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I have to confess I'm a theoretician, so I will not attempt an exhaustive answer here. But let me instead say that you're very much correct in pointing out that in nature you have evolution in many traits going on at the same time, not only body size, and therefore you see these divergent clades and so on, you have frogs and birds, and they are not really the same. But I think still that the insights you get from a model like this could be applicable. You have to fill up this size niche dimension. I also do think that there are cases where you actually see this speciation within clades. Maybe not so rich communities, but in, I would guess, freshwater lakes and so forth, you could see this. But I have to pass on giving specific examples, and perhaps someone else in the audience can help me out later on.
Maybe worthwhile pointing out in this context that in order to link such models like this to reality, it doesn't really matter whether diversity arises through in situ speciation or through immigration of appropriate types, which then undergoes further microevolution. So while we will probably have rarely full assembly in situ through speciation, we'll probably often have the combination of integration of different types combined with further evolution. Mike, can you elaborate the microphone?
I'd like to know if it's possible that the body size feature can be a stand-in for other kinds of things. One can imagine radiation of mammals, for example. They started out without carnivora. The carnivora were closely related to herbivorous mammals, but somehow became carnivores. Perhaps they didn't do it with body size. Perhaps they did it with a combination of other features. But is it possible to read this as a more general variable that could take the place of those?
Yes, as long as it affects trophic interactions, I think you could, but it's pretty much set up as it is for body size, since you have this size asymmetry assumption maximizing interactions. So perhaps another way to introduce this would instead be to include either on top of this or instead of this, a more abstract niche trait, if you so would like, that can represent anything from size, and look more generally at what type of interactions would we expect and explore that. And we have actually started some work in that direction with a colleague, Shobana Roll from India, now working in Canada as a postdoc. And it turns out that having this second dimension actually complicates things quite a lot. You have a much richer community emerging, and you can even see red queen dynamics as a result. So it's quite interesting, but hard to make sense of, and we're still struggling to get some classification and insights from this.
All right, other questions? Yep, one more. Microphone coming.
So how long do you return the logic to the model? Because if it takes some time for the individuals to grow, they can shift their feeding preferences during their growth.
Yes, that's also a very good question. And indeed, it is something we have started to look at with some colleagues from Denmark. But it's I should say, or stress, is technically very much more challenging to do this type of work if you have a continuous size distribution. So currently we're on the stage where we can look at the initial diversification, and we can run some simulations to build up a community, but much remains to be understood. It's, as I said, technically challenging. Some of the assumptions that we rely on for this work, for the evolutionary dynamics, no longer holds in that context. And yeah, interesting road for the future, but still ongoing work, I think, is the summary.
Good. Do I see any other person raising their hands? Then